Here we are. We're live.
Again.
All
right, we're back for another show on
lockdowns. Everyone's favorite topic.
What are lockdowns? I missed that.
Yeah, there's some prison term, right? Where the prisoners riot and they put everyone on lockdown.
Right, okay.
That was the definition of the term until
That's
like
right, yeah.
16 months ago.
Right. Until it became something much more benign, supposedly.
Yes, to save lives.
Safe beneath the watchful
eye.
lockdown of government. Yeah. So this week we're basically going to be talking about lockdowns, the effect of lockdowns, the toll of lockdowns. I mean, probably most people watching this have
Experienced it.
experienced it and know a bit about lockdowns and, experienced it themselves, yeah, for sure. And I've read a bit about it and stuff, but we're just going to go into the details and we're going to kind of have a, almost like a debate, you know, in a certain sense. We'll give a bit of both sides of the argument because we want to be fair and balanced, right?
Indeed.
And just to try and explore, try and tease out the most likely truth of the situation and what people can maybe conclude about the whole thing. You know, not that it's over necessarily. I don't want to be giving any promises that it's all done, because we have, in a few months, we'll have an autumn/fall season into winter, and who knows what's going to happen then. There's all sorts of talk of variants and different things like that. So we don't know what's going to happen, but certainly we'll talk about how it's progressed over the past 15 months or so.
Yeah.
And the reason for it, and the arguments for it, and the arguments against it. One argument, well, you could frame it, I suppose you could frame it in a way, in the following way. You could say that lockdowns were an unprecedented and unwarranted attack on civil society by government and global health bodies. That could be one argument of the debate, and that could be one side.
Attack would be construed as very much a partisan take on it.
Well,
and
but-
they would
but
say,
that would-
well, okay, it was an unprecedented intervention in society.
Well, no, but
and a
it has-
necessary one.
Well, it has,
from
but that's
certain
the other
points.
side of the debate. That's
Yeah.
one side of the debate, that it was an attack. So if you imagine this was a debating society, basically, one side would be arguing for that it was an unprecedented and unwarranted attack on civil society with terrible effects. And the other side of the debate would be that it was a justified response to an unprecedented
Threat.
health crisis from a virus, and that it was therefore necessary, and it actually did a lot of good. Ultimately, it was in the public good. There's a fly bothering me. Anyway,
Get lost.
where's my fish? Anyway, so yeah, we'll kind of try and tease out both sides of that argument. I mean, you know, I think one will be a bit more lengthy than the other, in a certain sense, because by definition, the one against lockdowns has a lot of data from the lived experience of billions at this point, billions of people, and all the metrics from society that have been publicly, have been shared and made known. Whereas the argument for it being a necessary response to a deadly pandemic and stuff, much of that is in very opaque or complicated scientific literature, and the argumentation for it is, even by proponents of it, it's still the argument, or the case for it is still speculative to some extent, because it's a developing situation, right? And it's a new novel virus, and they don't necessarily know all the things we need to know. So it's a discovery process. So in one sense, there's much more data on one side than on the other, but they both have. Both arguments can be summed up, equally well, I think.
Yeah, and let's try and frame it. How would they justify it? They would say, official numbers here: 3.97 million people have died from COVID, in quotes. How many were saved?
Yeah, well, that's
by the lockdowns. that's unquantifiable.
Right. Yeah, but that's kind of getting ahead of us. That's the other side of the argument. Let's start off with the argument against lockdowns.
Well, okay, and let's do this by listening to what some experts are saying, and not what we're saying. Obviously, the title of our show is "The Terrible Toll of Lockdowns." Okay, well,
So we're biased.
We're biased. That's our take on it. Let's pull up the first bit of data. This is a recent article published in the British Telegraph, June last month. Lockdowns are the single biggest public health mistake in history, says top scientist. Who is this? This is Professor Jay Bhattacharya. He's a professor of medicine at Stanford University. He actually told the Telegraph this in a podcast, but this article here summarizes some of his statements. If we can scroll down there a bit, Scotty. Let's see where we start. See there in the second paragraph. There have been, quote, enormous collateral consequences of keeping people inside and isolating them from their loved ones during the pandemic. Telegraph here. The epidemiologist believes many scientists have clung on to the perceived effectiveness of lockdowns, and they, quote, remain attached to the idea despite, quote, the failure of the strategy. I do think that future historians will look back on this and say that this was the single biggest public health mistake, possibly of all history, in terms of the scope of the harm that is caused. This is Bhattacharya one last time. Every single poor person on the face of the earth has faced some harm, sometimes catastrophic harm, from this lockdown policy. Also in the Telegraph, a month prior in May, there was it's a strange kind of admission of sorts. It was a bit of it's a mea culpa in part. I mean, the headline says enough of it, doesn't it? The use of fear to control behavior in the COVID crisis was, quote, totalitarian, admit scientists. Okay, so who are these scientists? Anyone can say that, whatever. The scientist in question was on the SAGE advisory committee advising the British government throughout these lockdowns.
Right.
Okay, so let's scroll down. There's a lot in this article to unpack, but I'll go from the start. The scientists on the committee that encouraged the use of fear to control people's behavior during the pandemic have admitted their own work was, quote, unethical and totalitarian.
Oops.
Members of this Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behavior, SPIB, expressed regret about the tactics in some new book that's out about the government's response. Oops. They claimed that they warned in March last year, 2020, at the beginning of this, that ministers... Actually, this makes sense. This is the mea culpa. They are admitting, we scientists on this committee warned the government that they needed to increase, quote, the perceived level of personal threat from COVID-19 because, quote, a substantial number of people still do not feel sufficiently personally threatened. Well, and to his credit, the name is given. Gavin Morgan, a psychologist on the team, now says, clearly using fear as a means of control is not ethical. Using fear smacks of totalitarianism. It's not an ethical stance for any modern government. And he says a lot more. Let's scroll down, actually.
Well, he says there, by nature I am an optimistic person, but all this has given me a more pessimistic view of people. Should I not give him a pessimistic view of himself?
Exactly.
Who's he talking about?
Well, he kind of explains why he states that now further below. Let's scroll down a bit more after this image.
Stay at home. Filthy peons.
I don't know if this is Gavin Morgan again. It could be someone else. But another scientist on this committee stated, in March last year, the government was very worried about compliance and they thought people wouldn't want to be locked down. Well, of course not. There were discussions about fear being needed to encourage compliance, and decisions were made about how to ramp up the fear.
But let's Yeah.
And then the way we have used fear is dystopian. So
Let's
that's
come away from that for a
their own
second.
words.
Yeah. But that's interesting to ramp up the fear. What did he say again? I have it here in front of me. Yeah. Not ethical block. Okay, you should. I don't have it. I don't have it in front of me. But he basically is saying that they needed to increase the fear in order to enforce compliance.
Yeah.
But for what purpose? Was it just for compliance? I mean, there's a kind of a disconnect there in the sense that if there was a threat to the public, they obviously decided that the public wasn't smart enough or they were too stupid to perceive that threat themselves with
Yes.
their own eyes. And the threat was directly to them, right? And it was not by, it was essentially a threat that was directly impacting them, and they themselves would have some measure of control over it, I suppose. I mean, in terms of looking after your own health or, taking measures and precautions. But people looked at the situation, looked at the messaging from the government, looked at what was being said about the virus, and according to these people, they were not scared enough
Yeah.
because the government didn't get the message across, or I think they did. That's the point. I think they did get the message across very well, but the problem was that people went, meh, a lot. People probably said that they would allow for some government hyperbole and maybe whatever different agendas, whatever people might have thought. But clearly, people who thought about it decided not to follow the rules to the strict letter of the new laws that were imposed. And the government decided that wasn't allowed. And they had to, I mean, there's a lot of articles like this that have said the same thing, basically. Yeah. And the impression you get from it, and even from SAGE, I mean, that mention of them increasing the fear to ensure compliance is in an actual SAGE document. That's an article we showed there, but you can look at the actual SAGE meeting minutes, this government body deciding what they should do about in terms of imposing or implementing the lockdowns. And they said that there was a real sense from it, and I think it was implicit in it, that it had to be exaggerated artificially.
Yes.
Increase artificially the threat.
Now, they don't quite state
They don't
why.
say that. Well, they don't say that, but they don't. I suppose it's assumed why, that there's a deadly pandemic, people are all going to die, and these stupid people don't realize that they're going to die, and we need to terrify them so that they stay at home so that they don't die. That's basically the message. Right?
Okay, but if that is the message, why is there a lack of explanation in the mea culpa after? We went too far. It further says in that article, we were actually surprised, we were amazed or surprised by the extent to which people did comply once we did do our initial assessment. Okay, they're not taking this seriously enough. Then we terrorized them, mea culpa, but then they went too far.
People. Well, that's very true. I mean, I'm sure lots of people, maybe everybody watching this, and millions more people around the world have personal experience of either with themselves or more likely with, given the nature of the people that tend to watch our shows, or that it's more likely that it's a family member or a friend or someone they know. But I have multiple experiences in that respect of people I know who took things really, really far.
Yeah.
I mean, some people didn't leave their houses for months. They got groceries and food delivered to them. One family I know, even the parents, who weren't really in bad health or anything like that, but they were just in the age bracket where they were supposedly under serious threat from this virus. They stayed in their house. They brought their daughter in, who was unmarried and was available to move into their house, and she lived downstairs. They lived upstairs, basically in their bedroom for months, and they didn't actually see her while she was living in the house with them. She was there simply to do the shopping, to buy groceries, and to make the food, and she would deliver it
outside the door?
to their door of their bedroom, and knock on the door, and then
slink away.
Then slink away quite quickly in case, because she had been out shopping and she might
I
give
brought
them
it
something.
home.
Yeah, so that's for me. That's a pretty extreme. That's like real. That people took the confinement, self-confinement to a real, like really literally, some people anyway. And I'm sure there's other people, like I said, have similar stories. And that's just one example of the kind of things that people did.
There's an implication hanging.
So that'll be the reason I said this. That'll be an example of these people in Sage in the British government thinking, "Uh-oh, we went a bit too far."
Okay.
If people are doing that, that's too far. And also, other stuff we'll get into in terms of the psychological or mental health effects of the whole thing on large numbers of people. And we'll get into the details in a minute.
Yeah.
But
I wonder if this.
By the way, should we just, before we can carry on, just on the chat and in the comments, if anybody's got any questions, maybe Scotty, you keep an eye on if you can highlight anything that pops up that anybody says or anybody is worth mentioning, or if anybody's got any questions.
There's one here. On my uncle's orders, my mother was talking to my granddad through the letterbox for months. He's 90 years old.
Oh.
For months. God, the poor man. There's an implication that's hanging in here. If they're saying, oops, we went too far, and people bit too much, more than we expected. We thought we understood human psychology. Oops.
Mm-hmm.
Are they saying, or at least was this one psychologist on the committee saying the measures were unjustified?
You mean, you're asking, is that what they're implying?
Is that what he's implying?
I think
because
so.
Surely if there was a raging global pandemic, whatever it takes to induce or scare people into, come on, get to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's justified. But this guy seems to have real remorse at the end of it. He talks about this dystopian nature of it, anti-democratic, disgusted.
You'd have to assume that from that what he's saying is that he's saying that the way people reacted to it and the lockdown, the extremeness or the extreme nature of the lockdown and the way it affected people was disproportionate to the threat.
Yeah.
For him to say that. Because if it wasn't disproportionate to the threat, and he's an insider and he would know, he would have access to more data than the general public about the actual nature, the actual numbers and death, the actual the threat to the public health that this virus posed. He would probably have that information, and when he looks at the two sides of it, it seems him and others, because it's scientists here, it's members of the SAGE committee, a few of them anyway, who spoke out and did this mea culpa. So you have to assume that they're saying that this was over the top, it was unnecessary, basically.
Yeah. So that was one take on it from a top UK insider.
Well, yeah. Was there another part in that about where he finished in that same article about him saying that psychology?
Ah, yes. Can you return to that one? I think it's tab number 2, Scotty. We'll scroll down a bit. Oh, yes. I see it now.
Another said.
He talks about the dangers of overreach and power and drive, blah, blah, blah. We have to be very careful about authoritarianism. Well, it's a bit late for that, dude. But anyway, he then said, or someone else says,
he
anonymous,
says, actually at the top, the use of fear has definitely been ethically questionable. It's been a weird experiment. Ultimately, it backfired because people became too scared. Yeah, right. Anyway,
weird experiment is definitely one way to describe this
and
lockdown.
He said, another said, psychology has had a really good epidemic, actually. What does that mean? Well, I suppose it's obvious what it means. But it's almost like on a positive note, psychology as in behavioral scientists who have spent their lives looking at how people behave and trying how to,
Isn't it interesting? Gavin Morgan obviously didn't mind his name being published and the quotes attributed to him. This is another, anonymously probably. Isn't that an interesting, different internal reaction to it? Well, on the plus side, we gleaned an awful lot of interesting information from running this experiment.
Psychology has had a really good pandemic, which for me that says, and I know some of them directly, and I know others, indirectly, but
who? Top insiders?
Yeah, no, I know scientific type, like career scientist types, and most of them, a lot of them, all of them labor to one extent or another in relative, on some of them in absolute obscurity for decades in their offices or in their labs, depending on their discipline. And they, they don't get a lot of credit. The vast majority of them get no credit. And, obviously in behavioral scientists working for the government, be similar type people, right? They're not in the limelight. They're not famous. They don't get mentioned anywhere. So there's a big element of this, and this goes across into other disciplines as well. But in behavioral scientists, sure, the idea of a pandemic and then lockdowns in particular coming along is like a dream for these people in terms of their career and being able to put into practice on a broad scale with a legal mandate all of the things that they've been studying,
the models,
and researching and modeling for years, but were never able to actually put into place. It's like they're like, yes, finally. A lot of them have that reaction, and that's not being. I mean, maybe it is a bit suspect or a bit dodgy, but it's understandable at the same time, and because the same thing applies, and even more importantly in the context of this pandemic, same thing applies to epidemiologists and virologists who likewise have laboured for decades, many of them career scientists in dusty labs with no recognition and never really getting to, really, prove themselves or test their theories in a real world way.
Yeah.
And actually, that applies also to one particular career scientist who for whom the pandemic has been a real boon, and his name is Saint Fauci.
Oh, hail Fauci!
All hail Dr. Fauci, because there's a video. Actually, do we have the video there, Scotty? Of this is just a couple of months before the pandemic broke out, and it's very prescient. I think it's that's it right there. Have a listen.
Tuberculosis, an ancient disease that we tend to forget about, but it's the leading cause of infectious disease death throughout the world, 1.6, 1.8 million deaths per year. So you have malaria, tuberculosis, HIV. These are things that are there. And then the other thing that I aspirationally hope to be able to encounter is the ability to rapidly respond to something brand new, whether it's a brand new pandemic or, as you mentioned, a brand new attack upon us deliberately by bioterror.
Yeah. So you can actually leave it there and let's just hear him say that last bit again. It's actually queued up already, Scotty. Just keep going.
Then the other thing that I aspirationally hope to be able to encounter is the ability to rapidly respond to something brand new, whether it's a brand new pandemic.
That's it. So,
well, his hope came true.
Well, for me, that's really interesting, and it speaks
2 months before.
Yeah, even a month or 2 months or whatever it was an interview did. So that speaks to what I was just talking about people like him who, I mean, I had never heard of him before. He obviously he used to be the director of the CDC and stuff. So he did
most
have
Americans
a bit of, no, but most Americans don't pay any attention to people like that, even when they're in the position of the director of the CDC, because, whatever, they're not really interested. They don't have much to say. There's nothing much that's relevant to their lives. But so he's in that, even though he was the director of the CDC, he's a bit more in the limelight. He's still in that
director of NIH, but okay,
well, CDC before, no,
possibly.
I think he was,
but he's been,
but
as far as I know, for decades. Yeah. National Institutes of Health.
Well, okay. So Fauci is there expressing what millions of career scientists and virologists and epidemiologists around the world are probably feel as well, in a certain sense, although they're not necessarily directly involved. But a lot of them were called on, a lot of them were asked to give opinions and stuff. So suddenly a lot of them were in the spotlight, and a lot of their papers, a lot of their research were being consulted and used. But Fauci in particular expressly said there, and he emphasized it in a kind of bizarre way. He said aspirationally hope, which is like, the second one of those two is a bit redundant, right? Aspire to and hope, same thing. Anyway, but it was for emphasis, I suppose. He aspirationally hopes, doesn't hope for, he aspirationally hopes for a new pandemic, to be able to respond to a new pandemic. That would be don't even get me started. I would love a new pandemic. Because then I would get to respond to it, and all my work would just be boom out there. I'd be like, well, I'd get that virus, I'd smack it, even though
I
I'm
chase
only
that
5 foot.
virus.
We've got some interesting comments on the chat here.
Even though I'm only 5 foot, I would take on that virus. What?
We've got some interesting comments on the chat here. Let me scroll up and hopefully people will stop typing. One person says, my friend was mad that her husband wouldn't close their business, so she made him live in the basement and left his food at the top of the stairs. And then another couple comments. A girl at work was particularly in fear and freaking out for a good while over the pandemic. I finally suggested she should turn off her TV and stop listening to it. She said, you sound like a crazy person. I said, you sound like a crazy person. She has since calmed down and realized she was overreacting.
Wow. Well, yeah.
Wow.
I mean, those people, you can understand a lot of people, at least if they come back from it, that, you know,
Yeah.
they were subject to massive fear-based programming from incessant 24/7. You're going to die, you're going to die, all your loved ones are going to die, your grannies are going to die, your parents are going to die, you might die, stay indoors, lock down, don't go to work, you know, hands, face in space, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's understandable, but it's the people who persist in it at this point, you know, that they're a problem with maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah, so yeah, that's that. The point about Fauci there is that he's. You have to understand that people like Fauci.
Well, he's more of a political animal.
He
He's
is,
a particular.
But there's plenty of other people
careerist.
in that same mode across different disciplines who have been given a new lease of life in different ways through different aspects
Yeah.
of the actual pandemic or as a result of lockdown. And they actually, it's a good thing for them, for their careers and for their sense of self-worth maybe, you know. So it's one aspect of why, if you're wondering why the whole thing seems to be really, you know, they're really, some people might be getting the impression that it's being prolonged, and the fear-based programming is they're keeping it ticking over in the background when maybe it's not necessary. Well, there's personal reasons for that
Yeah.
among some of these people, and that's just turning the psychology back on the psychologists, right? On these behavioral psychologists who are using fear to program the population. But why would you do that if afterwards you're going to come around and say, "Oh, that was very bad"? It was, some of them anyway,
Yeah.
said that was a bad thing to do. Well, I can tell them why they did it if they have any kind of, if they wonder about it, if they have any sense of, if they have any introspection or whatever, wondering why they did it. They did it because it was interesting to them. The whole,
Yeah.
it was an experiment, like in the article, one of them said it was like an interesting experiment for them to conduct. So there is that divide that people have to keep in mind: ordinary people of the world who are subjected to pandemics, and the people who are in theory or in one way or another subjecting them to it. There's a divide between those two people. We're not all in this together, despite that slogan being parroted over and over
Yeah.
again. It's not the same. There's differences between those two groups of people, those two different.
Yeah, and it speaks to
positions.
why they were reluctant to let it go. I mean,
Yeah.
to admit mistake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I won't threaten anything, but plenty of threats have been made about, you know, criminal culpability. That's in the air, and short of that, I can't see, because there's so many people will be implicated.
Mm-hmm.
I can't see that actually happening, although
No.
arguably it ought to. But no, short of that, the gravy train stops.
Mhm.
There's no more knocks on the door for interviews. And they return to that obscurity.
Right.
How can they go back to that after
Right.
2 years of
They
the
don't want to.
limelight?
A lot of them don't want to, you know. So yeah, but let's get on to more details of the actual negative effects of lockdown, like we started with. The next one was on our list was what, murder rates.
Yeah, and let's look at this. The murder rate. This was not easy to get some solid data on. I mean, I actually thought, wrongly as it turns out, when this started, my first fear was, Jesus, crime is going to go up through the roof. And my thinking was, you've got people locked in one place, their homes typically, or in all cases. So you don't have the movement, the normal
People on the
movements
streets,
back and
yeah.
forth, eyes on the streets.
Right.
That's going to be a rampant opportunity for crime to go
Mm.
up. In fact, by all accounts, crime was down
Right.
everywhere.
And that's
Petty
because-
crime.
That's because it was so, the programming was so convincing that even the criminals were terrified, and they stayed at home as well.
I think so. I think so. 'Cause
I'm not
remember, there were
joking.
statements from ISIS at the beginning of this, telling their members, the brothers in Syria
Yeah,
and
yeah.
elsewhere, Allah Akbar, the Western scientists have said they don't know shit. Science was originally from Allah, so ergo, stay at home. They
Yeah,
said something similar, yeah.
All,
So,
their 7 wives all had to stay at home. Oops.
so
Anyway,
in general, crime is down, but for one subcategory, murder rate has gone through the roof. It's not global though, as far as I know.
Right.
It's hard to find. No one really keeps track. You usually only get good stats on it a year or two later.
Mm-hmm.
But it's clear that in the United States, the murder rate is up. For a source on this, let's pull up Vox News.
ooh, awesome.
This is from April, so it's
I
fairly
love Vox,
recent.
I love Vox News.
Now, they claim in the headline that they explain it. Well, they don't really. But anyway, they give a good rundown of the stats. So let's scroll down a bit. And okay, so based on there in the
Preliminary
second
data.
paragraph, based on preliminary FBI data, the U.S. murder rate has increased by 25% or more. That's actually a low ball. There are other estimates from individual states that are talking 30+%. So anyway, that amounts to more than 20,000 murders in a year for the first time since 1995. So it's not unprecedented for the U.S., but it is for, let's say, the last 3 decades.
It's the largest increase in violence we've seen since 1960. Wow.
Okay, and that probably includes more than just straight up murder stats.
Right.
Not only were murder rates up overall, they were up. This is interesting. They were up practically everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just, for example, murder rates went up. I'm not actually reading from Vox here. I'm reading from The Economist for this stat. Murder rates increased 56% from 2019 in Chicago, 45% from 2019 in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
Not everywhere was that high in the US, but all the same, it was up everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So averaging out across the United States, a 30% increase in homicide rates in 2020. That's from 34 U.S. cities. So it's unique to the U.S. I think the left-wing analysis of that is, well, duh, guns.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that simple.
Never is.
It never is. But I suppose access to guns is a factor because this is kind of a separate topic we want to discuss later. But the numbers of suicides in the U.S. was also up.
Right.
Probably. Again, there are no central stats. But because they are so diligent with keeping an eye on gun stats, they know that there was something like... Let's see, I have it here actually. I don't think we'll pull it up for people, but
Mass shootings?
mass shootings comes in a second. But I just wanted to say that they know that suicides from self-inflicted gunshots, which
Okay,
are
right.
most gunshots in the United States every year, were up something like 20%. I don't have that. Maybe we'll touch on that later because
Yeah.
we want to talk about suicide rates. So,
In that Vox article, its mass shootings were up more than 46% last year, even as high-profile mass public shootings
yeah, that's a
were
weird
less
thing.
common. I mean, there's a difference between the two, right?
The U.S.
One's
was quiet. Not just the U.S., but the media was quiet
on terrorism.
relatively because of terrorism seemed to fall off a cliff. And also mass shootings, it seemed, but depending on the definition you use of a mass shooting, one that's typically used in the US is 4 more people are injured, injured or killed, not including the gunman. At that level, that broader definition, mass shootings were up last year.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't have thought of in the media
No,
because we
because-
remember the high profile
And you
ones.
gloss over those in America, particularly in America anyway, gloss over the kind of like the drive-by gang shootings, that kind of stuff, you know, or people just gone crazy. But yeah, definitely those are up. There's stats on mass shootings year on year over the past 5 or 6 years, and every year in the US they've gone up, like just generalized, like by that definition of 4 or more people, whatever. They're up year on year, 20, 30%.
Horrific thing is a lot of them were, don't quote me on the number, but a lot of them were where the lockdown just got too much within a home.
Right. Yeah. Well, that gets into a different category, which expands the world as well, which is domestic violence.
Yeah.
There's stats from the UK, or that domestic violence. I mean, people can check this for themselves. Domestic violence reports and events were way up, and also child abuse events were way up. Now you can say that's an evidence of bad people, but you got to be nuanced about the whole thing. Is that people have outlets for their frustrations and their anger, and they have a social circle that they that contributes to their general state of happiness. And when that's taken away, they become less happy, and violence becomes more likely.
Yeah.
And violence is if you're feeling violent or you're feeling angry, who are you going to take it out on if you're locked in your house? Well, the other people in your house, right? So that's directly attributable to lockdowns for sure.
Yeah. I mean, general rage
Yeah.
stories cover all kinds of things. The stats on this extend beyond the lockdown because it's stats for last year, 2020 and 2021. Is it the fault of lockdown? Well, we know what happened when the first lockdown ended in the US. Mass rioting. That was explicitly connected with
Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter, but also at the time, I remember a psychologist trying to, generally the leftist media was kind of making an out for it by saying, well, yeah, they've been cooped up for months, right? So, that's a factor. And okay, well, fair enough, but that has carried over in all walks of life. People probably have stories, but brawls and queues, just tempers are shorter than ever before.
Yeah, and
general antisocial behavior. There's one
counter-staff.
metric that's just makes it super clear. Now that people are back flying, air rage.
Right.
I've got something on this. Can we look at the tab on the FAA's stats about air rage incidents? I think.
Which one? Madigan, you say?
Yeah, that's the one. The FAA has seen a significantly higher number of unruly passenger reports in 2021. Okay, so there were partial lockdowns in some states carrying over into 2021. But yeah, I don't know how we could not see this as connected to specifically being cooped up last year when they were not flying.
For sure, to carry over. And it's worrying because it suggests that it's permanent. It has a permanent effect in
Yes.
a certain sense. You know what I mean? Because people are now more or less out of lockdown and stuff in 2021, especially in the US where there's a lot more air travel and stuff, but they're feeling the effects of the previous year.
Yeah. And I should clarify that although that article mentions that there were thousands of incidents just involving compliance with masks, but excluding that, the FAA has a separate stat on specific unruly passenger violations to the point where they had to be kicked off the plane or police called in or whatever. And just on their tradition, the metric they normally use, they reported a jump from, in 2019, there were just 146 air rage incidents. But in 2021, just until the end of May, so the first 5 months of this year, 394.
Wow. That's a lot.
That's a huge jump. So, tempers are flaring. It's definitely lockdown related. I don't see how we can say, well, they're out now and it's not connected. So we covered murder rate and general mayhem. Suicides is, like we've mentioned, hard to get a good number on, but
They're definitely up.
everyone has anecdotal stories. I do as well. I mean, I don't know anyone who died from COVID, even officially. I don't know anyone who has that on the death certificate. I know of people who kill themselves, though. It's a topic no one wants to talk about at any time because it's horrible and who wants to advertise it, right? But there's all the same. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence. Let's have a look at one here. This is the tab marked depression, Scotty.
Tripled. Wow.
Yeah. Depression is tripled in the US. That's one metric. If you see there below, before the pandemic, 8.9% of US adults reported being depressed. That's a jump to almost a third
Struggle.
through the pandemic.
Yep. Yeah, and then there's another Nature magazine.
I don't think we got that one, but check the next tab.
Oh yeah, okay.
This is from the Nature study. Nature did a study published much more recently. I think it's from April this year. So it's a meta study. So it pulled in data from a lot of different places. Look at that below. U.S. adults reporting symptoms of anxiety or depression.
11,
Pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, almost half.
of the population. Wow. Yeah.
And from there, you can extrapolate to suicide. I mean, you can understand why they don't want to shout this too loud. I mean, there's been all kinds of fact-checking articles. Oh, there's disinformation on the web about suicides going up. That's because people only had anecdotes to share. And that's what they were discussing for the most part. It wasn't fake news pushing it. It was people trying to express that something horrible had happened to people they knew, and they were sharing stories and so on. Anyway, there are some hard stats from other countries because they're not so reluctant to hit the worst information, the worst news anyone can have.
That next one, suicide, right there.
Okay, so this is anecdotal from the US. That's an interesting one because typically girls and women are far less likely to commit suicide, to go the whole way. It's men and young boys who will do that. But there's a huge jump in the females in the United States is actually also matched in Japan. They're talking about suicidal ideation. They haven't actually committed suicide yet, but nevertheless, hospitals did record that that's what they were in for. I presume that includes self-harm and mutilation.
Yeah.
Everything short of suicide.
That's the next Financial Times article. FT.
No, we didn't get that one.
Okay, we didn't get
But
one.
I do know what the FT reported. I have it here in front of me. The FT reported that Japanese statistics show I think it was a 15% increase in female suicides in Japan through 2020. Similarly, there, women and young girls are far less likely in general. So the spike affected. It almost seemed to be an equalizer in that domain. Women and girls were much more affected, I think, by the lockdowns. Finally, there's one more bit of data. Well, I think we just covered it there from The Hill. Yeah, it's huge. That's the CDC's own stats, collecting it from American hospitals.
Which one?
The one from The Hill. We've already touched on it. It's the previous one we looked at. Yeah, this one. If you scroll down there, there it is. That first statistic. ER visits related to suicidal ideation rose by 50.6%. Actually, I mean, that's an unbelievable jump.
Wow.
Okay, so how many of them actually follow through? Again, actual suicide statistics are always delayed or obfuscated in general in the West. I do know, though, that in India, they keep tabs on this much more meticulously. We don't have the statistics to show people here, but you can look it up. India has the highest suicide rates in the world. It's the biggest cohort is because of farmers,
Right.
subsistence farming. They lose their livelihood, they're done for. They don't have a safety net. So it's a well-known phenomenon. I think India accounts for something like a third of all suicides. It's horrifying. But in 2020 alone, and this is attributed by their own health authorities, lockdowns contributed to a 67% increase in suicidal behavior. So not out-and-out suicides across India. So that's the world's largest country when it comes to suicides. That's a 2/3 jump. I mean, I think you can see how horrifying that picture is globally if you extrapolate these figures out. Will we ever find out? Who knows?
Sexual assault, France24.com. We have that one.
We don't have that to show. No,
Okay.
it was just that covered both bases. It covered the increase in France, something like 20%. increase. Again, that was hard to tabulate, though. Do you know what they were having to do in France? And I think it was similar in the UK, maybe also in the US. Because people were under lockdown, normally, especially women, battered wives, or young girls, adolescents, would call hotlines from home.
Right.
Or from the mobile, but still from somewhere discreet and private. Those calls fell off a cliff as soon as lockdown started
Why?
because the abuser was at home with them.
Right.
Or word could get to the abuser because he
Right.
was in the close family network.
Right.
So the calls fell off a cliff. In France, I know that they set up an informal system where young girls or women would go to pharmacies and there would be and Spain also, I believe, and there would be a code word they give,
Right.
Mask 19 in French. And that would signal to someone behind the desk who would get help or get a call or get them some kind of help.
Yeah.
So a lot of that, as horrifying as some of the headlines are about the scale of domestic abuse in 2020 because of lockdowns, a lot of it could never be quantifiable
Yeah.
because it had to be kept stum, you know?
Yeah. I mean, and this doesn't even talk, we're just going to touch a little bit in the economy, but I mean, that doesn't even talk about what we haven't talked about, and we're not really going to get into too much because it's pretty well known. But as a result of lockdown, a lot of healthcare systems were partly mothballed in a certain sense. A lot of staff were sent home. People were told not to come to hospital. Or, well, they weren't told explicitly not to come to hospital, but none of them came. And I mean, there was a point last year where the Irish and other, Irish Prime Minister and other leaders of other countries had to explicitly go on TV and tell people that if they were feeling ill, that they should go to hospital, because people were not turning up at hospital. But on top of that, that was, you could blame that on the people. Well, ultimately, it's because of government fear messaging that people stayed at home and didn't go to hospital and just died at home when they had a chest pain, for example, and didn't get to hospital. But through the way that the different governments manage the health care system, i.e. limiting it to through the messaging and people not going to hospital, and also by sending a lot of staff home and turning people away when they did come.
But they completely retooled the primary healthcare system.
Right.
Which is, okay, I have a complaint. What do I do first? I call my GP.
Right.
What happens at that point? My GP goes, I'll call a specialist.
Right.
At that point, okay, come to hospital. No. So those normal gateways were just folded over.
Right. You're not allowed to go to hospital anymore. But they were telling people to go to hospital as well. But that was only after the fact, whenever they realized that people who were actually in severe need, what they were basically saying was that only people in severe need should go to hospital, because even they weren't going.
Yeah.
But everybody else, and here we're talking, my point is that cancer screenings and heart checkups and all that kind of stuff, we'll put links in the show description afterwards, but 10 million cancer screenings missed.
Where? Just in one country?
I think in the US. 10 million, yeah.
And
in the US alone.
What's the discovery rate? Usually a third?
I mean, it's hard to quantify.
Something
but
high. A significant portion of those will be positive.
Right, but then the delay in that screening means an increase in deaths,
in the risk,
in them being untreatable or not being treated in time, and people dying. So those are all kind of unquantifiable, but you can certainly assume that when it's 10 million in the US, when it's 2 million in the UK, and maybe a bit less in France, and in most other countries, you had, at least Western countries, you had this situation unfolding where people were basically not getting primary health care, and a lot of that stuff's missed. So you can work it out. I mean, when you're talking about millions of people, you can say that there's going to be a large number. But if you even put it at 1%, it's probably a lot higher. Put it at 10%. 10% of a million, 100,000 people. That's...
They're lockdown deaths.
Well, that's down the line as well.
Okay.
Because it's...
There are people missed now who might have been saved 5 years hence.
Right. Or, who... Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's all put on the long finger, if you know what I mean. It's put down the road type of thing, and it can be then the numbers are far enough away from lockdown or from that event to actually attribute it to them, but they are actually attributable to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So economics.
economics will go through quickly. Inflation is up. Everyone knows that. I mean, there's a obvious price rise in certain goods. Foods, meat is going up and up and up. Lumber. Lumber is a particular one. Okay, so wood. So how did that happen? Well, that's something that was warned by us and plenty of others at the time. You're going to break supply chains. You close certain businesses. If you just close all of them, not just the front end, the stores you go to buy the end products. If you close all of them, there's going to be these backlogs. Some of those backlogs will never return. There'll be bottlenecks that are they're not just temporary bottlenecks that
Well, it goes all the way back basically from
Yeah.
the people who order the raw materials who then make them and stuff. They stopped doing that, and there was a certain period where in many countries where government projects as well, which are you think would be the last things to be shut down, like all private projects, building projects and stuff, were stopped. But even government projects were stopped. So there's a massive amount of materials that would normally have been purchased and used that weren't being purchased and used. So they weren't being purchased by the stores that supply them. And then the manufacturers kind of stopped buying the raw materials and so on. And it's not easy to restart that just like that, because people, they're saving, they're focused on their bottom line. They're not going to make an order for the normal amount of stuff that they order because nobody's buying it, so they don't make that order. And then to kickstart, and if that lasts for months and months and months, it's not easy to kickstart it again, you know.
Yeah.
And especially if a lot of businesses who would actually supply them have gone out of business. You know, the front end businesses, smaller ones have shut down. There's going to, across, you know, large countries, there's a lot of reduction in actual demand as a result of that, you know.
Just one last thing on inflation, actually, before we talk. I'll go back to closed businesses. Officially, it was up 5% year on year for 2020. For anyone who remembers like decades of neoliberal monetary policy, the one thing that central bankers constantly hammered on about, and it was drilled into us at university. Everyone knows this. It's economics 101. Keep inflation down. 2%, 3% max. At that point, you need to start raising interest rates to cool the economy. And they have their theoretical reasons for why that's important. It's the point is, it's doctrine. Last year, that doctrine just went out the window.
Right.
La la la. It didn't even figure in. And so by the official figures, inflation was up 5%. I suspect real inflation was up way higher in 2020, and it's still going up. Anyway, so that's just a side note. On the real impact on the streets, the next one I want to show up, Scotty, I think it's a tab, closed businesses. Who's this from? This is from Fortune. Okay, so this is by September last year. Nearly 100,000 establishments that temporarily shut down are now out of business. Okay. That means that, well, it's not clear what that means, because that happens all the time anyway. Year on year, 100,000 or more can close down, and 100,000 more can be started.
This is 100,000 extra, I'd say.
I think it's extra. I couldn't get that clear from that article. If you go to the next tab, this clarifies it. 60% of those business closures, of that 100,000, according to Yelp's data,
Are now
are permanent.
Yeah.
They are gone.
They're not coming back yet. Yeah, and the thing is
That's an enormous swathe of
the thing is that's been
economy.
massaged, or the effect of that has been mitigated in different countries by, especially in Western countries, by government help basically for individuals and for businesses. You know, that people, even those businesses that went out of business progressively, they were getting help, so that people didn't mind closing their business and moved into something else or something. But even people who lost their jobs were getting stimulus checks. Even like Scotty got a stimulus check. I don't think he cashed any of them because he wanted to frame them, right? Did you get stimulus checks?
Yes, I did.
And what did you do with them? Did you buy?
I bought all Bitcoin.
You bought Bitcoin.
No,
Good job.
I didn't.
There were some pretty big stimulus checks. You bought 2 Bitcoins with your stimulus checks.
I bought 0.00001 Bitcoin.
Right. Well, that's more. Still, you know, it's going to go to $5 billion, I think, this time next year. So you'll be a millionaire by then.
Yeah, when it started, I predicted doom on this score, but you're right. They actually rolled out this safety net
Yeah. For
to
what?
unbelievable extent. In the UK, like 80%
The workforce.
of the workforce were being paid by the government for
Full
large
salaries.
stretches of the whole of 2020,
Yeah.
up to 80% of their salary.
Yeah.
And then they had the reverse problem. This is psychology 101. A lot of them didn't want to go back to work
Right.
after that.
Yeah. Can I have free money too?
Now, people suffered in the West, but the real squeeze is surely on non-Western countries
Right.
that also went full lockdown.
Yeah, for sure.
But we can touch on that briefly later about the effects of global poverty. We'll get to that next.
Yeah, do that now,
Just
yeah.
before we do, while what was 60% of 100,000, 60,000 small businesses in the US were wiped out for good last year, the wealth transfer upwards was
Crazy.
the record high. Let's go to the next tab. I think it's called that wealth transfer. This is from Jim Cramer of NBC. He said it. And look at the date on that. That was by June last year. The metrics on that were clear. The first lockdown alone was at least one of the greatest wealth transfers in history. There's no reason to believe that trend didn't continue through what he describes there as the V-shaped recovery. Yes, indeed, the US economy came back from that first lockdown, but the picture was completely changed. And that's borne out especially in the next article. No, it's not.
Oops.
No, maybe I didn't include it. Anyway, it was an article from the New Yorker. Maybe it's the one preceding that.
Nope, that's an image.
That's an image. Okay. Anyway, indeed, it's Wall Street profits had their record year in 2020.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
to be expected, I suppose.
Globally, right from the very March last year, the UN was warning about the impact on the non-West. Okay, so it's going to be a safety net rolled out for the West. What about everywhere else? I'm not sure. There are so many different. The stats range from like 130 million people up to 500 million, depending on whether you're listening to the World Bank, the UN, or the UK government's own report about the numbers of people who'll be pushed into poverty by lockdowns. I'm a tad suspicious about the readiness with which they were reporting that so early. Perhaps that's misplaced, but I was wondering about it because the kind of call was being made immediately, and I think moves were made in this direction for massive wealth transfer. There was something afoot as part of, it's going to be bad here, but it's going to be really bad over here. So let's get all these funds to the World Bank, etc., IMF, and we'll just redistribute it properly. So you had this. I mean, for argument's sake, let's say Wall Street didn't conspire in any way here. They got the single biggest wealth transfer because of the circumstances of what happened.
Yeah.
Everyone stayed at home and they went on Amazon or Netflix.
Right.
And those companies,
And started
profits went up.
spending far more time on the internet, subscriptions on the internet for all different, news services or for different services online, basically, because they were stuck at home.
Yeah. But when it comes to some of these global claims and programs, look, maybe I shouldn't be suspicious. I just can't help think of the Great Reset and whatever they were trying to do with wealth redistribution programs. But don't forget that 200 million people are about to go into poverty too. This justifies X, Y, Z, Anyway, I don't doubt that the effects in the West were bad. They were worse elsewhere. So we have to wait and see
Yeah.
just how bad. We touched on the next one already in terms of the cost in terms of other illnesses that were neglected by this extreme focus on COVID-19. The statistics on this are, as yet, obviously, there's never going to be a frank. As soon as there's a frank investigation, a simple calculation, it's straight away. It's gonna beg for investigation, and it'll be like never again. So there'll never be a straightforward mea culpa on this. But a number of experts have been pointing out and keeping track on specific areas throughout this. So this next one we're going to look at is from Carl Hennigan in The Spectator. So he published this recently. Carl Hennigan is a professor of evidence-based medicine at Oxford University. He's been an advisor to the UK government. Now, they pretty much shut him out, but he was also advising the Irish government, basically on the, for God's sake, be cautious side from the beginning of this. In the end, he's I don't know if he's writing articles in Spectator. I doubt they take him seriously anymore. But he did keep some numbers. He did keep track of some numbers. You see there, I've highlighted. He's got that since the pandemic, we've had 28,200 more deaths among diabetics than we would normally have had. For heart disease, 17,000 more. For dementia and Alzheimer's, 22,000 more. So this is, I suppose, he's taking the excess death rate year on year and homing in on the specific spikes. And what these metrics tell us of the extent to which the focus on COVID-19 and saving lives, remember, lost so many lives.
Well, that's 70,000
in these other areas.
That's in the UK.
That's in the UK alone.
That's actually in well, it's maybe just England, but if it's the UK in general, it's almost 70,000 people, and the total deaths from COVID are about 120 or something like that. So that's like about almost 2/3 of the so-called COVID deaths,
right? From just 3 other illnesses.
Were caused by lockdowns, and that's just those particular details. That doesn't include other deaths caused by, because there's dementia patients and the shutting down of primary healthcare and all that kind of stuff that caused a lot of deaths. There's another report from, I don't know if it's Carl Hennigan, but in the British Medical Journal last year, that there was, out of 30,000 deaths in care homes, and most of those are dementia patients, 20,000 were not attributable to, an excess of 30,000. 20,000 were not attributable to COVID in April and May, I think, last year. That was just in 2 months, and that had to be because of lockdown, because April and May were the two major, March into April and May were major lockdown months. So that's another 20,000. So you're up to 90,000 deaths that are not excess deaths, that and primarily probably amongst older people and vulnerable older people, the ones we're meant to be saving. There's up to, at least by those short few statistics, and that's not a complete totaling of them, you have possibly 90,000 excess deaths not attributable to COVID, but attributable to lockdowns.
Right.
And that's just that. Like I said, that's not a final tally.
Right. It's begging for someone to do this. I mean, we don't have the time.
Not allowed to, Neil.
To do it, but for the
Don't
statistics fiends out there, I mean, you could get 2 tables. Okay, there's your official numbers of deaths from COVID. This is the official. From let's agree on a set of the most common killers, or the worst killers above the rate of mortality that COVID has. Let's just stick with those.
Yeah. So basically, I mean, that's pretty much, I mean, there's a few other bits and pieces, but I think that gives a good overview of the kind of nefarious effects of lockdown, the really terrible effects of lockdown. And all of them, the argument, as we mentioned at the beginning of the show, for lockdowns would say that all of those deaths, and again, they haven't been totaled by any official government or public sources. They haven't presented in that way, but we're presenting it, that data, and it's, like I said, it's not complete. But even if that was presented, I mean, I suppose anytime that argument raises its head, the counter argument is that they were all necessary, and even any deaths, therefore, were acceptable or necessary. The deaths we have detailed were necessary because this was a deadly pandemic, and lockdown was necessary to protect people, even though, as we've just said, it killed an untold large number of people, directly and indirectly. It was necessary to protect much greater deaths, a much greater number of deaths from SARS-CoV-2, that there would have been a lot more. Of course, we go back to, at this point, we got to modelling and Imperial College modelling, where they initially, your guy Ferguson, government scientist type guy who put out at the beginning of the pandemic, said that if we didn't lock down, there would be 500,000 deaths in the UK. In fact, I think he was saying that there would be 5,000 anyway, because he's been roundly kind of, dissed for saying that, because the deaths only amount, by the end of last year, they only amounted to about 90,000 or 90 or 100,000. So he was at least 5 times out of whack, off the mark.
Yeah.
So that fly's bothering me.
But then
that would seem to be that he was saying that this was going to happen anyway. Expect these deaths, and it fueled lockdowns, and it also his modelling informed like different countries to do the same thing, including America. So it was like that, supposedly that alarmism. That was the narrative anyway, that his and the modelling by him and other people, which were telling of, in America, telling of 2 million dead and all this kind of stuff, was what motivated severe and harsh lockdowns. But it proved that those deaths didn't happen anyway. And he was saying that they would happen even with lockdown. So he was proven wrong. So modelling, obviously, on that score, in terms of that's a chink in their, or a dent in their argument, at least from the very beginning, that this was a horrible, deadly virus that was going to kill scores and scores of people, because obviously it didn't, even with lockdown. So go ahead.
another one, obesity.
Right.
Scotty, you were saying that something like the average American has put on how many pounds, or did last year in the first lockdown?
I don't remember. I remember reading an article. I think it was something like 27 pounds, something crazy like that. It was just from lockdown and being, I guess sedentary and watching too much Netflix or something. I don't know how accurate that was. That was just like, I don't even remember where I read it. It was some mainstream news site, and they just said, oh yeah, the average American put on X number of pounds, and it was 20 some. And then I went.
And of course, what's one of the key comorbidities with COVID? Obesity.
Right.
Talk about pro-cyclical.
Right. That's in all of the literature, and all of the underlying conditions, as they call them. Is obesity is big in all of the in the list, top of all the lists, or up there in all of the lists, along with other very common underlying health conditions. If we go to on that point, if we go to the MSN article, I think you should probably have it. It's MSN. No, next one.
Oh, there we are. No.
Well, that one will do. All disease models, that's what I was talking about. All disease models were tested and failed massively. That's from the American Institute of Economic Research. That's just pointing out the fact that all the models at the beginning that hystericized supposedly governments into imposing harsh lockdowns were completely wrong, sometimes by a factor of 10. If you just go to the next one, that addresses the point about underlying conditions. The CDC itself, and this has been talked about for a while and debunked by various fact checkers and all that kind of stuff, that the CDC came out late last year and said that only 6% of the of deaths, of the total supposed COVID deaths, only 6% of them actually died of COVID. What they're saying basically is that, as it says there, 94% had underlying conditions. And that's a big bone of contention, right?
Right.
Whether or not COVID is responsible for the death of people with underlying conditions. There's actually, well, maybe I'll try and get into it a little bit. there's an interesting study published by Fauci's National Institute of Health, so it's definitely fact checked, definitely approved, right? I think it's the next tab, maybe, is it?
That one.
Okay, we'll stop on that one. That just backs up the other one. 99%. In the US, 94% of patients had underlying conditions. In Italy, 99% of those who died from the virus had other illnesses. Now that just left like that. They had other illnesses, as if that's, people can draw their own conclusions from that. But just go to the next article. Yeah. So this is the Fauci National Institute of Health. Causes of death and comorbidities in hospitalization patients with COVID-19. Now, they basically, the interesting thing about this study is that they took 26 people who were confirmed COVID deaths and they did autopsies on them. Like, autopsies are the gold standard. If you want to know what killed someone, you have to autopsy them.
Right.
Ultimately, really, if you want to be absolutely sure. So they took only 26 people, but still, these were 26 people who died in German hospitals, and a bunch of people, excuse me, autopsied them. And this is very much a pro COVID is a deadly disease article. If you read it as a study, they basically are saying that well, what they go down through it, and there's no point in going down. I can read it here. Actually, they say the majority of disease patients in their study had diagnosed comorbidities. And they talk about hypertension, that's high blood pressure, chronic kidney or heart disease, chronic pulmonary disease, and that kind of thing. But they also say that their findings, and they just say this basically, that their findings indicate that the immediate causes of death were directly linked to lung damage initiated by SARS-CoV-2 infection, and not related to pre-existing health conditions and comorbidities in most cases. So here they're drawing that conclusion that they're not related to them. If you read it, they don't know, they don't explain the rationale in saying that, because previously they go through the fact that pretty much all of these patients had multiple serious underlying health conditions, including chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, actually like very weak, damage to a large extent lungs. But that if a person with COPD, who has long-term COPD, difficulty breathing, needs oxygen a lot, if they get the virus, if they come in contact with SARS-CoV-2 and then they die, it's SARS-CoV-2 that killed them, and not their long-term COPD.
Yeah.
Now that's fine if you want to say that, but if you say that, then for all the deaths among the elderly over the past decades, every winter, primarily amongst the elderly, sometimes younger people, but primarily amongst vulnerable and elderly people who die in hospital as a result of the flu, complications with the flu. You have to go back, or you can't go back, I suppose, but from going forward now, the flu has to kill an awful lot of people that were never killed by the flu before. Because before 2020, if someone with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease for the past 10 years came into hospital and died as a result of,
catching something while there.
Well, no, died of lung failure, basically stopped breathing and died, it was, if they were known, and they would have been known as having COPD for 10 years, it was COPD that killed them. They would never investigate. They wouldn't even mention the flu. They would know that they probably got the flu, because this is the thing about the flu. All these comparisons between SARS-CoV-2 and the flu was never analysed in the way SARS-CoV-2 was before, so you can't draw any conclusions.
Yeah.
All they ever did with flu was estimate the number of people who died each year from the flu. They never did any serology tests or any PCR tests or anything like that to find out if an elderly person who came into hospital with any number of different issues, like chronic, like high blood pressure, or atherosclerosis, or coronary artery disease, or kidney failure, or anything like that, if they had these chronic illnesses, and if they died in winter of had to put in a ventilator, had to be put in a ventilator, and then died of, basically they stopped breathing, they basically just gave up, their lungs gave out. But if they had chronic heart disease, that was the cause of death.
Yeah.
And flu would probably never be mentioned. And they wouldn't be able to mention flu because they would never do an autopsy or any kind of a test, even PCR test, to find out if they had an influenza virus in them at the time of death.
Yeah.
Doctors, anecdotally, or to each other, or in the hospital, would say, yeah, the flu probably killed him. And doctors have said this for decades. They called the flu the old man's friend. Without knowing for sure that they had it, they looked at the symptoms and said, yeah, the flu the flu did him in. He was 85 years old. He had long-term health conditions. He came to hospital with breathing difficulties, and he passed away in the night.
And
he
the
just stopped
flu
breathing.
was an act of mercy.
And the flu put him over the edge.
Yeah.
That viral load on top of his immune system, which was already compromised for a long time, was enough. It was a way out, basically.
Yeah.
And that's what they did. And flu, no, certainly not in the death certificate, and just assumed, well, his major underlying condition is what killed him. That was totally upended in 2020, directly by missives from the World Health Organization and the CDC to recategorize. And just going back, they could not ever put the flu down as a cause of death on a death certificate in those cases, even though by today's standards with SARS-CoV-2, it should have been put down as a cause of death, because that's the way in this article I'm talking about in the NIH, they're basically saying, no, it's SARS-CoV-2 did it. Even if they had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, it was SARS-CoV-2 that killed them.
Right.
They should have, in the past, always put down flu as the underlying cause of death, or one of the underlying causes, or whatever.
Yeah.
But they couldn't do that because flu was never categorized as an officially identifiable disease, basically, or a recognized disease. I can't remember what the actual term is, but it's basically, it didn't have its own code as a disease that would kill people. Influenza. This last year, SARS-CoV-2 was immediately upgraded to nationally identifiable or nationally notifiable disease.
So there's a code that they could put on the death
Give it a
certificate.
code, and it can be the only thing that killed you. It can be, and it's elevated, and doctors across the world basically were told, listen, SARS-CoV-2, deadly, it killed people. If you see someone, and you can look back, we published these at the time. I published them on Facebook, and we probably talked about them at the time in previous shows, where doctors were actually told, or physicians who were filling in death certificates were told explicitly, if you have a patient with 1, 2, 3 serious comorbidities, 85 years old, above life expectancy, not long to live, if you do a PCR test, or if you find evidence of, even if you don't do a PCR test, but if you do a PCR test and you detect SARS-CoV-2 goes on the death certificate. And also, even if we don't do a PCR test, if the clinical symptoms, leave it up to your
Right.
judgment, doctor. If you reckon
It matches COVID-19 symptoms.
done.
It's incredible. There
your-
seemed to be a scrounging for
Yeah, well, they justified that.
COVID-19
They
deaths.
justified that by tracking it.
And
They wanted
blinding
doctors
out
to
of
do that,
this.
to track this virus, to see where it was going. That's what they said. That was a weird thing. They really, really wanted to track this virus. And you could think that was understandable if they were under the impression that it was a deadly pandemic that could sweep the world and wipe out half the world's population. So we got to find out where it's going so we can lock it down and stop it from doing anything. But it was very well. It was known even from Chinese studies at the beginning, because China was supposedly where it started, right?
Yeah.
Chinese scientists published studies, and it was pretty clear. It was definitely easily inferred from Chinese studies that this was a virus that was primarily dangerous to
the elderly.
the elderly, vulnerable, and immunocompromised.
Yeah.
So
And furthermore, that the case to fatality rate was low.
yeah, so why do you want to? It's basically at that point, even though it has a higher, it's not really higher. It's actually slower in transmission, but it does have a worse effect than the flu on people who are vulnerable to it, and where it reproduces and replicates within them and their immune system can handle it. It does have a worse effect than the flu, but it's still not in the category of something that's going to wipe out half the population. So why do you want to follow it then? Why do you want to upgrade it to a nationally notifiable disease so that you can track it and force doctors to put it down in all the death certificates so we can find out where this thing is, when you know already that it's pretty much in the same category as the flu, even though it may be 2 or 3 times more deadly among the people who are susceptible to flu and other flu-like viruses. That's still not a big number, because flu deaths every year, again, they're estimated, they don't know, but they're very small. They've never been an issue. The flu deaths are seen, like we talked about before, old man's friend. Nobody really cared about it. It's an easy way out. And sometimes it's a blessing. So if this is something that's like so insignificant, well, as 2 or 3 times as significant as the flu, which is very insignificant according to governments and around the world, and always has been, why do you go DEFCON 1 on it?
Yeah. It causes all this damage.
And cause all the damage that we've just talked about. Yeah, so But just on that point, actually, there's one more point I want to add to that, and it's the Yahoo link there, Scotty, if you can just pull it up. This is something that should be remembered as well.
I saw this before, yeah.
And this is just one of
Not just
several
Italy.
studies. Italy, France,
Israel,
Israel,
Iran.
in the US as well, as we talked about last
Yeah.
week, in many different places, at least 6 months before lockdown was imposed in Western countries. It was in Western countries. Now you tell me, how long does it take for a virus to spread once it's in the population? Let's go to the next one. Let's look at the National Geographic. Go to the next screen there, Scotty. How did coronavirus spread so far so fast? Go down a little bit. One thing we know about this mysterious pneumonia-like illness dominating world headlines, it moves fast. Starting in a food market in central China, the new strain of coronavirus moved to the nation's major cities, jumped borders to neighbouring countries, and has now shown up on the west coast of the US, all in 3 weeks.
That's
That's
fast.
around the world
That's fast.
in 3
Effectively.
weeks. But it was in Italy in September, and France, and Israel last September. So if it spreads, how long does it take to spread among the population? And if it's, I mean, certainly it's spreading among the Chinese population if it's in a short period of time, and then within 3 weeks it's moved which direction? I don't know which direction, but it seems it came kind of east, maybe, because a lot of travel maybe between China and Europe, and then spread that way across came westwards into Europe and into America in 3 weeks. So once it's there, then how long does it take to spread around the population? Moves similarly fast, right? Among the population under no lockdown conditions, right? September,
Like wildfire.
right? So where were all the people dropping dead and hospitals inundated
Between September and March.
at least, and March last 2019 and 2020? Why didn't that happen? And more to the point, bring it up to today. I don't know if anybody knows that there's a European national football championship going on, and they've been playing in different countries around Europe. Some stadiums are kind of more or less empty. Some of them are half full. Some of them are almost full. Wembley the other day, in a big stadium in London, for an England match, had 60,000 people in it. Most of them relatively young people. And the UK only has about a 60% or so vaccination rate, most of them amongst the elderly population. So it's fair to say that at least 50% of the people in that stadium, of the 60,000 people in that stadium, had not been vaccinated. And they won, so they were very happy, kissing, spitting, licking, whatever English people do to each other at football matches, right? Gnawing on each other. So surely we should see after that, that's a super spreader event. That's not super spreader, but that's an event where certainly this deadly virus and the Delta variant that's on right now is a perfect petri dish to see that half of these people at least are going to be in serious difficulty any day now.
Yeah.
I mean, let's give them a couple of weeks. It's been a few days, so give it a couple of weeks. We should see a big spike in cases inundating hospitals, wherever those. I mean, probably a lot of them are from the London area as well. You know, there's 11 million people in London. We should see a big spike in London for sure. It's a good test case, you know, but obviously you can tell by the way I'm talking that
That's not going to happen.
I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen.
It was happening after the first lockdown. When the first lockdown was eased and certain mass gatherings, let's say, of a less approved nature were taking place, protests, some protests, not all protests are equal. It's some of them. There were big headlines. Oh my God, all these people, super spreader events. Well, they're going to drop dead. It'll serve them right for getting out there and mixing. You were told what the science is. You were told what to do about it, and you didn't follow the rules, and now you're all dead.
Yep.
Or at serious risk of some serious illness.
Right.
Over and over and over again. But it's interesting, yes, by now, let's say an approved event, the bread and circuses are coming back online, the UEFA Football Championship.
Mm-hmm.
The media is not haranguing these people about that because, well, vaccine uptake is going well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's this misuse of science, this rank abuse of science. I mean, not just in the immediate present of the last 16 months, but going forwards, like, is this what we have to look forward to? Like the work you've done to bring us to that question of tracking things, of reading the NIH study, of having to infer from the words what they're not saying. What they're not saying is that to get those 26 autopsies to say what it should say, according to the COVID science, they had to redo the assumptions that went into all the science on epidemiology and the spread of viruses before
Right.
that. That's this abuse of science. And they tout it like it's logical, it's rational. The science says, look, don't be such backwards peoples. Just, okay, if it's too complex for you, so just follow us on it. Well, we have followed your logics. We've followed your scientific arguments. And you changed the science in March 2020. You changed fundamental assumptions to make, well, actually, to borrow the term from a previous year, to make the facts fit around the policy.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I mean,
Well
that's our conclusion, I suppose, that it's, you know, in this pseudo debate we've been having. I mean, we didn't present an awful lot of data, but there isn't an awful lot of data from the side of the pro-lockdown, deadly pandemic side. It's pretty well known what they say. It's a deadly pandemic. Look at all the people who've died and stuff. But we've delved into that and shown, like I just said, in a few cases, and that continues to this day, that the vast majority of people who die from this virus are vulnerable, elderly, and immunocompromised people who have a very short life expectancy anyway, and are most of them at or above life expectancy age. So, if the idea is, I would like to know if the idea is that those people should not ever die. I'm not saying they should not be treated, you know, well in their ill health, but never before now have they been treated in that way. It's been assumed that people, once they reach a certain age or in a certain, you know, that in a certain health condition, like a bad health condition, that you don't go above and beyond to keep them alive, you know, that there's natural force at work here, and everybody has to die. It's like a kind of joke with people, you know, to kind of remind people that at 80 years old, your chances of death are significantly higher than they are at 60. And at 90 years old, your chances of death are higher than at 80. And at 100 years old, your chances again are higher than they are at 90. And that once you reach 200 years old, your chances of death are really, really, really high.
Astronomically high.
Yeah, and that it has to happen, you know, and that this virus, while it is more dangerous, again, to those particularly vulnerable people, more dangerous than the flu, it's not massively more dangerous than the flu. And I don't understand why there has been this massive shift in an effort to stop people who are in end of life scenarios, to tend to stop them from dying.
Yeah, especially now that we know.
And to stop them from dying in the way they want to stop them from dying, which is apparently it requires the lockdown of society and all of the punitive and destructive measures that come with lockdowns, and the effects that they have, the negative effects they have on
Everything.
the rest of the population.
There are other psychological effects we didn't touch on, but children's development,
Yeah.
children in schools,
Right.
the isolation, the face masks, wearing them all day. We've seen them here on the streets. You know, school's out, school's broken up. They're free now, kids. You don't have to. Also, you don't have to wear them outside. That mandate's been lifted where we are. They still have the thing hugging, this dirty mask hugging their face. Young infants need imprint. There's a certain imprinting phase. So
Yeah.
they have to see the adult's face. It's critical for development.
Yeah. So I don't know. It doesn't make sense when you look at it in depth. It really doesn't make sense. And the argument that it's a deadly pandemic that requires those kind of extreme lockdowns doesn't fit. Doesn't add up, basically, and especially in the context of the previous way that governments and health authorities responded to
Yeah.
these kind of viruses. And again, yes, it's a novel virus, and you can allow some wiggle room at the beginning where they freaked out. They thought it might be very deadly, but then to continue it on for so long and continue it on into a second year almost. We're almost at 18 months. And if they continue it on this fall, it's like it's against all reason, you know? And it can't be just because people are dying. You have to stop people dying. Well, how many people are dying? Which people are dying? Did you ever care that those people were dying before? Did governments ever care that those people were dying before? Is it normal or natural for those people in those conditions to die? If you really want to stop those people dying, why would you lock down the rest of the healthy population? These are, mostly, frail, vulnerable people. If you really want to, unlike what you've ever done before, if you really want to stop those people from dying, you should put them in bubbles and keep them closeted away and their carers and leave the rest of society to. I know people have said this repeatedly and you never get an answer to it as to why you lock down the healthy rather than the ill who are vulnerable.
Yeah.
Nobody ever answers that question.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of questions that haven't been answered, and it's a bit disturbing that those important questions that go to the heart of the issue that haven't been answered for 18 months almost, that some of them you're not actually allowed to ask. Why would you not be allowed to ask a question that people repeatedly don't want to answer? Well, the answer's in the question, right? They
Yeah.
don't want answered, so you can't ask it because it's, I don't know, because you don't like the answer. I don't know. We're left to speculate. When people don't provide information to you, to legitimate, reasonable questions, well then you can't blame people for then coming up with their own theories. If you don't want people to come up with conspiracy theories, give them answers, give them proper answers to legitimate questions, and make sure that your answers make sense. Because people aren't stupid, you know? I mean, because there's a lot of stuff here that doesn't require you to be an epidemiologist or whatever. It simply requires you to have a brain, be able to look around you and to draw conclusions from basic data. You know, and people are doing that, and that's provoking questions that are not being answered.
Yeah.
So yeah, I have my pineapple shirt on today, as you may have noticed, in honor of the 4th of July.
Party time.
Because this is so much America, right? Pineapple is a national fruit of America, isn't it?
One of Hawaii.
Close enough, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Today is July 4th, so happy 4th to our American listeners.
To American listeners, and to
Yay.
all non-American listeners as well, no? Because, I mean, by extension,
Today is our Independence Day.
we're all part of America.
Yes, the American
In a
age.
way. We're part of the American way.
On that note, well, in the UK, actually, the last few months anyway, been massive protests. British media doesn't touch them. Like, how many? At least 1 million. They look like the biggest crowds since the Iraq War protests in February '03, and there were over 2 million at that. Police help count them. They don't count anymore, so they don't report. But that's how they're protesting in the UK. That's heartening to see. Against the lockdowns, basically. In the US, they have their own unique styles. So we're going to play out the show with some footage from July 4th last year, after LA County mandated that fireworks were banned for the day because of coronavirus. I don't think they explained why. They were just banned that night. People in LA had a little celebration. So on that note, we'll say goodbye and
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.
And don't forget to subscribe and like and comment. That's pretty important for us to comment and have some activity on our channel so we can grow it. So appreciate all your support. So until next time.
happy 4th. See you next
Happy
time.
4th of July.
signal, Mel.